Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Victoria Solkovits, and I am the Director of External Relations for Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. We're really glad that you're all able to join us today virtually. We had once thought about maybe being at the point where we would be able to host all of you in person, but alas, we are not there yet, apparently, here in Israel. So happy that we could do this virtually. A little bit about Mitvim and who we are, and then what you can expect from this briefing. Mitvim is an Israeli think tank. We were established over 10 years ago, back in 2011, with the explicit mission of advancing peace and diplomacy in Israeli foreign policy. We have 5 main program areas, each of which you're going to hear a little bit from today. This includes Israel's relations with Europe, Israel's relations with the Middle East, the Mediterranean basin, advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace, and improving Israeli foreign policy, looking kind of at improvements in statecraft and in the foreign service. And our people are made up of both leading academics in Israeli foreign policy and academia, as well as foreign policy practitioners. So one of our program heads is a former member of Knesset. Some of our researchers are professional mediators. Some were actually in the foreign service and ambassadors themselves. So we're very familiar with the diplomatic community. We try inherently to actually bridge between academia and foreign policy practitioners with the goal of kind of advancing a better Israeli foreign policy for all. And our impact is kind of in a few different areas. Most importantly, with the Israeli government, we write original research and policy proposals and then bring those proposals to the Israeli government, but also with Israeli civil society and the international community. So this is all of you, and we're really proud to have a great history working with a lot of the embassies here for years now, and that is something that we're excited to do going into 2022, which is why we're happy to open it up with this briefing. A little bit about what to expect today. We are going to open up with having short presentations from each of our program department heads. This is going to be a short, about 10-minute kind of presentation overview about what is currently going on in that specific program area and the directions that us at Mitvim are kind of taking it in this year. Throughout this time, as you guys start formulating questions, feel free to send them in the chat. I'll go ahead and be monitoring the chat. And then at the end, we'll make sure that we have about a half hour at least for Q&A. Just so you know, the session right now is being recorded, but once we get to the Q&A section, we're going to pause the recording to make sure that you guys really feel free to ask whatever questions you might have about the different information that comes up. We'll also be presenting our Foreign Policy Index. This is our major publication really every year where we survey the Israeli public's opinions on critical foreign policy issues. So you'll get a little bit of a taste of each of the different areas that Mitvim focuses on, and a bit of an overview, as well as a chance to kind of ask questions about anything that you are particularly interested in right now as well. So with that, I will go ahead and take it on over to our first presenter. This is going to be Dr. Lior Lehrs. He is the head of our program on Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking here at Mitvim, to give you a bit of an overview and some insights as to what the field looks like right now. So Lior, feel free to unmute and take it away.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and it's great to see you all. So in my presentation, I will have 2 parts. I will start with a few words about the current situation in Israel-Palestine as we see it, and then in the second part, I will talk a little bit about the activities and the project that we are doing in Mitvim in this context. So first of all, I will start maybe with the current conflict, this situation of the conflict right now, the complex picture that we see. When we have some interesting development that can create some interesting opportunities, we have also major challenge. I will start maybe with some of the positive notes and then move to the negative parts, even though today the negative is the positive and the opposite. But I will start a little bit with some of the positive things that we still can see. First of all, if we are looking back, we can see the annexation plan that created all this crisis in 2020 is completely off the table. And we can see that the US administration came back, returned to the international consensus about Israel-Palestine. Biden administration is again renewing the relation with the Palestinian Authority after the rift that we saw. And after the last escalation in May 2021, we saw some more engagement with the international community in Israel-Palestine. In addition for that, also the regional developments that are very interesting, the normalization process, the normalization agreement, at the beginning was conducted maybe to bypass the Palestinian issue, but there are many hopes and expectations that maybe we can use it in order to promote the Israeli-Palestinian process. And actually it can be used as a leverage to make a progress also on this track. And of course, the important development of the new government that we have in Israel, when we have actually actors in the government that are talking about two-state solution, talking about Israeli-Palestinian peace. And we can already see some positive signs going in this direction. The interesting meetings between officials, Israeli and Palestinian, especially Gantz and Abu Mazen, yesterday Lapid and Hussein al-Sheikh. And we can already see some confidence building measures, especially in the areas of civil and economic aspects. But on the other hand, we still have a lot of challenges and many negative development. I will just mention some points. First of all, in the Israeli side, it's very clear to understand the Israeli policy about the Palestinian issue with this new government that is pushing for a different direction. And there is some kind of agreement not to deal with this issue because of the structure of the coalition. When some are talking about the two states, but others are saying that there will never be a Palestinian state, there will never be a peace process during this government, and one of them is the prime minister. And we can also see some gaps between the nice rhetoric, the nice meetings that we see, with the situation on the ground, that it's actually going completely to a different direction. And we can see some developments. We can talk about expansion of settlement, the situation in E1, the question of Givat HaMatos. We saw the eviction in Sheikh Jarrah, and the question of settlers' violence. And all of these developments are actually going to the other side, to the other direction. And we can see some clash between rhetoric and the situation on the ground. Also in the Palestinian side, the picture is very, very complex. We have a very deep legitimacy crisis with the Palestinian Authority. We can see a crisis of political crisis together with very complicated economic crisis with the Palestinian Authority. And also the lack of legitimacy with the Palestinian Authority leadership, and especially Abu Mazen, it's a major challenge. This is something we heard a lot in our dialogue with the Palestinian. It's a very complicated obstacle when we are thinking about making progress in the future. And of course, we have the internal Hamas-Fatah conflict that is also not going anywhere, and it's still an important aspect of that. Looking on the international perspective, it's also very, very clear that Israel-Palestine is not a high priority in the international agenda. It's completely understandable when you see all of these other urgent crises around the world and urgent issues that are much more urgent, but we can see that there is less and less interest in this conflict. We heard that in all the meetings and the interviews that we are doing. And we can see a real international strategy of what they want to do with Israel-Palestine. We can see that the quartet, that there are many expectations that during the Biden administration will become will be more involved, and it's not really active. And it seems that the engagement that we saw after the escalation was actually temporary, and we can see more than that. And also the hopes that we can use the normalization agreement in order to promote this process, actually it seems more and more actually very complicated, and it's not clear if the different actors are actually interested in using the normalization in order to promote it. And we have complex relations between the Palestinian and the Gulf state. So all of this is still a major challenge and how we can move forward. And against this context, Mitvim is trying, despite all these challenges, despite the complex picture, to think about how we can move forward, to try to identify the opportunities, to try to think about policy recommendation. I would say a few words about our activities in this Israeli-Palestinian context. First of all, I want to highlight that an important central project that we are doing this issue is a project that we are doing together with Geneva Initiative with the support of the British Embassy, what we call the British Project. That it's an important part of our activities when we are dealing with the Israeli discourse on the two-state solution and Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking in general. And I will mention the main 4 elements that we have in our activities on Israel-Palestine. One of them is the ongoing dialogue that we have with Palestinians, official and civil society. We created a few years ago a group, an Israeli-Palestinian expert group, that we are all the time having very interesting meeting and discussion, together with a very diverse group, including civil society, experts, former negotiators. And we learn a lot from this dialogue on the Palestinian perspective, on internal process going on in the Palestinian side. Another element is, of course, the contacts that we have with policymakers in Israel, in the Knesset and in the government, and a briefing that we are doing on this issue. And of course, the ongoing dialogue with international actors, that this is also an important part of our project, to learn about the international perspective and to understand what is possible and what is not possible. And all of these elements, together with the research that we are doing in Mitvim on the Palestinian issue and the expert team that we have in Mitvim, all of that actually allowed us to understand the full picture, looking on the Israeli-Palestinian arena and to understand the different perspective, the different interests of the different actors, thinking of how we can move on, even though we have all of these problems. And I would just, to conclude, I would like to mention some of the questions, some of the main issues that we are dealing with in the last year and also looking forward to the next year. So an important question is about the role of the international community, the role of the international actor. This is an issue that we have been working on for over the years. We published, for example, an Israeli-Palestinian proposal about an international incentive package. What kind of incentive the international actors can actually offer Israel and Palestine in order to promote a peace process on different aspects. We also published a recommendation for the Biden administration, what they can do in the Israel-Palestine. We also worked on the issue of the quartet, how we can maybe change the quartet in order to make it more effective. Another important issue that will be also a focus for us next year is how to link between the regional development and the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and to try to use, as I mentioned, and we have, Gil will talk about the index and the survey that we did, and we saw there is a wide support in the public, in the Israeli public, actually to use the normalization in order to promote Israeli-Palestinian peace. And this is something that we are trying to think how it can be done using the normalization state together with what we call the old peace states, the Egypt and Jordan, and all of this together in order to try to renew the Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking process. We also did a conference on thinking about 30 years ago to a Madrid conference, thinking of what we can learn from this experience on this connection between the regional and the Israeli-Palestinian track. Another important concern is to think about policy recommendation for the Israeli government of how to try to connect between confidence building measure together with some kind of a long-term political horizon, not just shrinking the conflict, not just small steps, but actually to pave the way for a serious peacemaking process, to create the infrastructure for the two-state solution, and also to outline a very clear red lines about how not to do any steps that will prevent a future solution, thinking also about aspects related to Jerusalem and also related to how to connect Gaza and the situation in Gaza to this process. And maybe just one last point about a very interesting new project that we are doing, that is together with the Hebrew University, the Davis Institute, I'm doing together with the Roee, that is actually looking on the contribution, potential contribution of internal actors inside Israel of how they can promote Israeli-Palestinian peace, not looking just on the usual suspect, diplomats or different decision makers, but actually, for example, artists and religious leaders and women organization, environmental organization, what they can do to contribute to promote peace and what kind of role they can play in this process. So thank you, all of you, and good to see you.
Amazing. Thank you, Lior. And just everyone, so you know, in the chat, I sent the link to Lior's recent paper that we did as part of the project with the British Embassy and the Geneva Initiative on the current international discourse behind advancing Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. So for those of you who are interested, that link is in the chat. Okay, and with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our second program area. So that is going to be Israel's relations with Europe. Maya, if you want to go ahead and take over.
Thank you, Victoria. So good morning, everybody. In Mitvim's Foreign Policy Index, there is one longitudinal question asked for the past 4 years, which finding to me are troubling. And it asks, is the EU today more a friend or an adversary of Israel? And you can see that in September 2021, 46% of the respondents answered that the EU is more an adversary than a friend. In 2018, when this question was first asked, 55% thought the EU was an adversary and only 18% thought that the EU was a friend. There is a slight improvement, but the numbers does not reflect the true nature of Israel-EU relations, which are complex on the political side, but so good and flourishing on the economic and functional side. We at Mitvim define the EU as the second most important strategic partner of Israel. Obviously, there is no rival to the relations Israel has with the United States in the security and political terms, but Israel ties with the European Union in the fields of trade, science, agriculture, tourism, aviation, to name just but a few, are more sizable and significant to Israeli lives than the ones we have with the United States. The EU and Israel are also like-minded in upholding the values of liberal democracies. So we at Mitvim are concerned with the bad public image the EU has in Israel, which stems from the political relations, encouraged by some populist political figures, part of the Israeli media and civil society organizations. One of our main recommendations to this government was to stop using the EU as a punching bag. Indeed, we see a major improvement in tone and dialogue, but this does not reflect yet in public opinion. In the past year, I have published several information papers giving data on the vast and deep relations Israel has with the European Union, their strategic importance and their influence on the well-being of the citizens of Israel, pointing to further opportunities which lies ahead. And I published a paper, for example, on the multi-financial framework, the budget of the EU for 2021-27, on Horizon Europe, another one on Open Skies Agreement, on Erasmus Plus program, and a colleague from the Ministry of Finance, Mark Lubin, wrote a paper on the option of improving access to the EU's market of services. As they are addressing to the Israeli public, they are in Hebrew, but so far we translated one to English, and this is the information paper regarding the market of services. One of Mitvim's foreign policy recommendations to the government is not only to improve Israeli-EU relations, but to go to the next level and to upgrade them. And we believe this government has the potential to do so. This aim is very high on the foreign minister Lapid's agenda. He is the first foreign minister in Israel ever to have traveled to Brussels less than a month after this government was established, where he met the High Representative of the EU, Joseph Borrell, and addressed the foreign ministers of the 27 member states. As Borrell said himself during Lapid's visit, this could be a fresh start so needed in the relations. To have such a fresh start, the EU-Israeli Association Council should convene. It can give a political mandate to open talks on partnership priorities, an agreement by two sides to what priorities to push in the next 3 to 4 years in the relations. Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan have such partnership priorities agreements. Israel and the Palestinian Authority don't have partnership priorities due to the lack of advancement in the peace process. As the current coalition agreement of the government states, there will not be a political process with the Palestinians, and the EU decided in 2012 that without advancement in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, there will not be an upgrade of EU-Israeli relations. We are stuck. So last week, I published an op-ed in Mitvim's blog in Haaretz calling the foreign minister to advance EU-Israeli relations in whatever fields possible without a partnership priorities, and in parallel to push for holding an association council. We have seen yesterday Foreign Minister Lapid meeting with Palestinian Minister for Civil Affairs Hussein El-Sheikh, and a few weeks ago, Lapid also met with the head of the Palestinian intelligence services. In yesterday's meeting, El-Sheikh stressed the importance of political horizon. And this is exactly the kind of recommendations Mitvim made to this government a few months ago, to stress the importance of political horizons. Lapid himself declared he believes in the two-state solution, but political time is not ripe in Israel to advance such peace process. The economic and humanitarian gestures this government is taking towards the Palestinians are a step in the right direction. Also, the various high-level meetings between ministers from the Israeli and Palestinian sides are important improvement from last year's. This should increase in volume, extent, and depth. And such steps send the right signal to the Palestinians, to the world, including Brussels. One of Mitvim's recommendations to the Bennett Lapid government is to hold a cabinet meeting on EU-Israeli relations. We think this government should agree on how to advance those relations and set their importance. All Israeli government ministries should review their current relations with the European Union and examine to which existing EU programs they would like to join, and to think ahead what they would like to put on the agenda of the partnership priorities to further upgrade the relations. The last question from Mitvim's Foreign Policy Index that I wish to share with you, Victoria, if you could share that, is the following. We asked, should Israel join EU programs that exclude settlements? And you can see the response. Our recommendation based on the data, which is shown in the series of information paper I published on EU-Israeli relations, is definitely yes. The Israeli government should sign such agreements with the European Union and join its programs. The territorial clause is a fait accompli that this current government should continue to accept, as was done by Netanyahu since 2013. This would be to the benefit of the State of Israel and to Israelis themselves. It would strengthen EU-Israeli ties in all levels, government to government, business to business, people to people, which stands at the heart of Mitvim's program on Israel's Europe relations goals. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Maya. Again, just so everyone knows, I sent the link to one of the papers that has so far been translated in English on this issue. I'm also about to send the link to all of Maya's publications in general, if you're interested. And again, if anyone has questions on what Maya or Lior has presented on so far, feel free to send them in the chat and we'll make sure that we address them when they come up in Q&A. In the meantime, though, we'll go ahead and keep on moving forward. This time we're going to have a presentation from Ksenia. Ksenia is our program director for Israel-Middle East relations. Ksenia, feel free.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and good morning, everyone. If 2020 was a year of a breakthrough with Israel relations with the countries specifically in the Gulf area and also in North Africa, 2021 can be already labeled as a year of a breakthrough in relations with Israel partners for peace who had joined the peace relations, the peace club, the so-called peace club, during the last few decades, meaningly Egypt and Jordan. This trend is very important because when in 2020 we witnessed the initiation of the Abraham Agreement, and we every day we opened our newspapers and we saw the speculations in regards to the possibility which country will join next, instead on focusing what is actually happening with Israel's partners, those long existing partners who are important to Israel's security and Israel's success here in the region. And these countries felt, some of them, they felt something, of an ambiguous feeling towards the Abraham agreements. Others, frankly, felt that they are left out of this process. And we wrote in 2020, and we continued to issue recommendation of policy also throughout the 2021 to connect the dots, meaning that Abraham agreements is a fantastic idea, but it will succeed even more and influence Israel's prosperity and security in a more profound way only if it will be also connected with increasing volume of relations between Israel and the countries with whom we have a mutual border here in the region, which are Egypt and Jordan. And of course, and this is still, something that we advised, but still didn't happen, but we hope that perhaps that it will happen in the future. Of course, connecting also the dots, including the Palestinians. So with the Palestinians, my colleague Lior thoughtfully described the situation that we are in right now, which is, in my personal opinion, is not satisfactory because in both fronts, in Gaza and in West Bank, we are experiencing right now very difficult conditions, turmoil in West Bank, a tension that can always bring us to another warfare in Gaza. But if we are focusing on the positive developments of the 2021, and it's not lacking of these developments. This is, of course, the diplomatic developments on the front of the Israel-Jordanian relations. This is a stark contrast to the policies that were waged by the previous consecutive governments in Israel during the last 10 years or so. We saw an increased volume of meetings between high-ranking officials, starting, of course, with Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, who met his counterpart. There were also some non-disclosed meetings between high-ranking army officials. And after a situation of a few years, during which we felt that Jordan is distancing itself from Israel, also the economic cooperation, that I think this is the major achievement, basically, of the Israeli foreign policy and energetic policy during the last year. It's, of course, the agreement on water and electricity between Israel and Jordan, which is also facilitated by the UAE. This is exactly the format that we also should support in the coming year, in the new year, in 2022, because the situation, economic situation in the ground, specifically in Jordan, but also in Egypt, is unstable, and it was damaged, of course, by the pandemics and its devastating effect on tourism and on other spheres of life. So when you combine, this goodwill that we experience right now in the Gulf countries with the already existing agreements who were stalled for such a long time, you actually receive a new vibe and a new feel of the energy that was long suppressed, and now it's finally probably coming of age. The same I can describe, but perhaps there was a less highlight on this during the last year on Israel-Egypt's relations. That we know that since the beginning, since the signing of the Oslo of the Camp David Accords, they focused primarily on the security aspect of the relations. So during the second half of 2021, there were a few meetings. This was a very symbolic visit of the Israeli PM to Egypt. There was also a visit of the Israeli foreign minister to Cairo. And if you are looking at the last 10 years of the Arab Spring, well, we could only dream that this kind of developments will finally take place. For a few years, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, president of Egypt, met Israeli prime ministers, but it was also kept in the dark. It was not a formal things. And finally, there was a official visit. Official visit also the FM, and also a few very interesting statements of the Egyptian officials that showed interest in elevating the economic ties with Israel, again, for the first time in many, many years. And I will just quote from our annual survey that you can, of course, find online and also here in the chat. You have a link to it. When Israelis were asked regarding the importance of relations with Arab countries, and they were asked to choose whether the security aspect is the dominating one, or perhaps the economy, the overwhelming majority had voted for economy. Also, when we asked them about the nature of relations with Morocco, we asked them about security, we asked them about the political ties and cultural ties, and they asked them about economy. They graded the economy number one. The same is with the UAE. With Jordan, of course, given that we have the common border and common challenges, the priority was still, of course, the one in security. But I have to tell you that, without taking more further time, but also having to say something about the Palestinian issue, also during 2021, we continued seeing that the Arab countries, and in particular, the old partners of Israel in the peace process, Egypt and Jordan, are very worried of the situation that is happening in the Palestinian autonomy. We felt it through telephone conversations that were made during the military operation in Gaza to the Israeli leadership. We felt it during the tone in the newspapers. Frankly, I can tell you that if somebody still dreams to just make a simple cut, Palestinian-Israeli relations, it's, one thing, and Israeli-Arab relations in something else altogether, then I believe that, and we believe in Mitvim, that this perception is somewhat mistaken, because you cannot really disconnect the Palestinian affairs from the larger context of Israeli-Arab relations. And we saw that precisely after the military operation in Gaza and all of the turmoil that we experienced here in the side Israel, in the mixed cities, we saw for the first time, for example, in the UAE, the appearance of BDS movement. It was not there before. It came out and was very loud, specifically after the war. And any turbulence, any turmoil that might follow in the West Bank, specifically in Jerusalem, of course, everything that has to do with East Jerusalem, will inevitably also have consequences for our ties, increasing ties and growing ties with our partners to the peace process, whether they are the new ones or the older ones. So you cannot really disconnect this. We in Mitvim propose to promote and engage the ministers of foreign affairs in the region in a closer ties, and perhaps to create somewhat of a circle of advisors, consultants that will perhaps be built around the top figures in the ministers of foreign affairs or defense affairs in the Arab countries, in order to have a possibility to, first of all, to test the Arab reactions, to understand when it has to do with Jerusalem, for example, with the situation with the Holy Compound, the Al-Aqsa, and so on. Can Israel perhaps promote its further understanding with the Arab countries and with the Palestinians prior to making some fateful decisions, taking advice, consulting, convening together and discussing the problematics, the possibilities, the opportunities that exist, and so on. So as you see, the last thing that I want to say, it's everything about the interconnecting all of the vectors that we have in our foreign policies, whether it's toward the partners who are a bit farther away from our borders in the Gulf, connecting them to the countries that are surrounding us, Egypt and Jordan, and interconnecting all of these dynamics to improving the situation in the Palestinian territories, and in the future, of course, reigniting the peace process with the Palestinians. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ksenia. And I just to echo that last point, I think it really talks to the work that we really focus on here at Mitvim, that yes, we have these different program areas. Yes, we have different researchers focusing on each program individually. However, we really do view all of them as being very intertwined and crucial to the success of the other. So really, really great point that I think you just made. Beautiful. Okay, so with no further ado, we're going to go ahead and move on to our program on Israel and the Mediterranean. That is going to be Roee. Roee, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And fortunately, it's not in person, but we'll get to that, I hope, soon enough, hopefully. I'm Roee Kibrik. I'm the head of research at Mitvim, also focusing and holding the file of the Mediterranean and Eastern Mediterranean. And I will present, well, just a short overview of what happened in this region, sub-region, what Israel does recently in this region, and what we in Mitvim are doing and calling for Israel and the other partners in the region to do. So as you all may know, in recent decades, the Eastern Mediterranean became a more defined and vital sub-region based on the natural gas findings and a series of corporations took form, relations have been transformed, agreements have been signed, and shared projects have been dreamed of. And in this changing atmosphere, Israel, uncharacterizedly, actually, played a cooperative role in all these processes. It promoted the Hellenic alliances, its relations with Greece and Cyprus. They imagined together the Eastern Mediterranean gas pipeline connecting Israel through Cyprus and Greece to Europe. Israel strengthened its relations with Egypt, as Ksenia mentioned earlier. It even reached out and extended its hand to Turkey for a time between 2016 and 2018, without jeopardizing its alliances with the Hellenic states. It joined hands with Egypt in initiating and establishing the regional EMGF, Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. So the region, sub-region, the Eastern Mediterranean region was widely characterized in recent years by cooperation. But not all the actors, and we need to remember that, not all the actors jumped on the stability wagon. Turkey, uncharacteristic and unnaturally for itself, found itself isolated almost for the last decades almost. Syria is subjected to its ongoing civil war. Lebanon is, subjected to Syria and Hezbollah and to a dire crisis, shorter way of crumbling down. And Iran works to provide weapons and fuel to Lebanon through this Mediterranean route as well. So this is in a large picture of cooperations and conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean. Became perceived as a different and identified sub-region that Israel is acting. When we look on the recent dynamics, we can find some new developments that is worthwhile to mention. Turkey is signaling that it wished to change course and to reapproach the states in the region. It seeks to warm ties with Egypt, with the Emirates, and with Israel, especially in the context of its economic crisis. The prominent role that what is called natural gas, yes, gas is also a fossil fuel, we should remember that as well, but its role has been diminishing. Well, don't overemphasize what I'm saying here now, it's slightly diminishing. But the course and the future is it's quite clear that the European Green New Deal, adding to that the states' obligations to reduce carbon emissions, the low price or maybe the changing or uncertain prices of the natural gas, all lead the states, the regional states here in the two main understandings. To hold two main understandings. First, they understand that they have limited window of time to use those gas findings in order to enhance their income, to sell it to the one who wish and can't pay, and a limited time to use it to support regional cooperation and foreign relations and policies. And secondly, they need to use this time in order to work together in order to develop new renewable energies, and they have to do it together. And they need to use this time in order to establish and base those relations and cooperation to exceed the energy realm as well. Another basic dynamics recently that the states needed to pay attention to and calculate their steps is the changing role and policies of the major power in the region, mainly of the United States. The states in the region are trying to understand and assess the US new policy in the region. Is it leaving? What kind of strategy it wish to promote here. And the states ask themselves, what can they do in order to keep the United States involved here in the region, to keep it obligated to security and cooperation in the region as well. So we can see how different states try to keep the United States involvement in different ways. We can see how different states also come closer to each other as to replace the United States backup or to prepare a local alternative that can be much more immediate maybe or reliable maybe. And we can see how regional institutions themselves, not just states, such as the Gaz Forum or the trilateral alliances between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, promoting new constructs that includes the United States, right? The Hellenic alliances call it 3+1, or the Gaz Forum invited the United States as an observer, and so forth. And not so detached from the last point, we can identify how the East Med becomes and conceived as a connectivity space. And that was the last point maybe that Ksenia made and Victoria mentioned as well. The Eastern Mediterranean conceived as a connectivity space between actors, regions, and different subjects. We can see how there is an attempt to connect the Gulf to the Mediterranean and bring, for example, the UAE to be part of or to be in relations with the Hellenic Alliance, or to be part of the Gaz Forum, the regional Gaz Forum. We saw that it didn't work out, but there's an attempt to do that. There's a European attempt, and Maya, I think, mentioned that, or that there is a European attempt to create connectivity and cooperation in its southern neighborhood. This is part of its southern neighborhood as well. And there is a growing linkage between what is happening in the Mediterranean and what's happening in the Red Sea. So in this situation, what Israel does in the region, Israel works to strengthen the Hellenic Alliance and deepen and widen their relation, not just on gas and energy or security, and it is a good thing that it does. Israel strengthening the relation with Egypt, deepening and widening the relation, and it is a good thing that it does. It relies on Egypt for mediation in the context of the crisis in Gaza. Still, the relations are managed by the security forces, focusing on security and energy, and there is a widespread sentiment of anti-normalization in Egypt. We need to overcome and change. Israel worked to, or willing to consider the renewing relation with Turkey, right? Not so in a hurry. Obviously, not on the expense of the Hellenic alliances, with quite cautious and mistrust of Erdogan intentions. Israel supports the regional Gaz Forum. Israel tried to keep the United States involved in the region. It tries and does fight the Iran presence and activity in the Eastern Mediterranean. We saw it in the maritime conflicts. It tries to bring the United Arab Emirates to the region, and it tries to find solution to the border conflict with Lebanon, the maritime border with Lebanon, willing to assist, and even willing to assist to prevent from its northern neighbor from collapsing through selling, as published, gas indirectly through Jordan and so forth. So what do we at Mitvim do, and what we think Israel should do more? So we call for warming up the relation with Turkey. We think it is a good opportunity, good course to embrace. It is wise for Israel to work to include Turkey in the region architecture. So aside from research that we do in promoting this in our relations with the government, we also conduct an ongoing strategic dialogue with colleagues from Turkey and discuss different opportunities, different perspective of how we can understand what's happening in the region and different policies that can be promoted. We do call for deepening the relation between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, as Israel tried to do, and we call to enhance this effort and to strengthen the civil ties and cooperation, strengthen the democratic values and build cooperation also in the context of mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis. As part of that, at Mitvim, we have in cooperation with PRIO, peace research in Oslo that has a branch in Cyprus. We're conducting research together, we're planning shared conferences and other shared projects that we do. We call to strengthen the relation with Egypt to move from security and now also from the energy realm and establish civil relations and cooperation. We call for Israel to use the partners. And this is very important, as again, going back to what Ksenia ended and Victoria mentioned and emphasized. We call for Israel to use the partners' abilities and opportunities that lies in the Eastern Mediterranean to support advancing peace with the Palestinians. Right? It's a different perspective to understand what's happening in the Middle East or in the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We have different abilities, different partners that we can identify there, and it can change or at least enhance the room for maneuvers in the Israeli-Palestinian realm as well. We wish to advance peace, cooperation, and institutionalization in the region. We embrace the good development of the Regional Gas Forum, but we wish to move or to push it further away, mainly to a shared or a forum more inclusive, also to include Turkey in other institutions in the region, focusing on and embracing the need to work together, mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis, maybe to establish a regional forum focusing on that as well. In order to support our research and work and dialogue in the Eastern Mediterranean, we established 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, a research and policy group focusing on Israel policies in the region. We initiated it and lead it with in cooperation with the Davis Institute for International Relations at the Hebrew University and with the Center for National Security Research in Haifa. It is a group composed out of 70 experts from Israel, coming from academia, civil society, and government, to discuss the different topics, challenges, and opportunities, and to recommend best policies and practices for Israel policies. Based on this group, what we wish to promote now is a regional civil society forum. This is a dream we wish to advance. If we could do that, if we could, and we try to recruit support and funding to implement this. And we wish to promote and establishment of a regional civil society regional forum to support and in doing, not just in researching, the regional cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean. We believe that the Eastern Mediterranean holds major opportunities for enhancing peace and stability and cooperation in the other region as well, and we think we should grab those opportunities. Thank you for listening and waiting for your questions or thoughts as well.
Great, thank you, Roee. I sent one research publication that came from that policy group that Roee just mentioned in the chat, and another plug for Roee that I want to put out there is that he is the author of our monthly diplomatic report. This is a report that actually summarizes the key kind of events in Israel's foreign policy and actually all of our different program areas. And we quite literally just published the one for December. So I'll send that in the chat for you as well, for those of you who want just a short kind of summary on the latest things kind of happening on the ground. It's a really, really great resource to have. So wanted to put that out there as well. Amazing. Okay, so now we're going to kind of transition into presenting our real major publication that kind of came towards the end of 2021. This is our annual Foreign Policy Index, and to present it, we are going to have Mitvim CEO Gil. If you want to go ahead, and the floor is all yours.
Sure. Just before presenting the survey and the Israeli Foreign Policy Index, a couple of words. I have the pleasure to summarize this great series of presentation. As you know, each and every one of them deserves a double click. We mentioned a number of fascinating and strategic topics, really. But first of all, as a former member of the European knowledge community, I mean, not the formal one, but as an advisor to the German foreign policy community, I think that when we speak about those presentations a little bit on the meta level, there are two major added values here, I think, as a former a customer, I would say, of Mitvim's insights. First of all, what you've seen right now is a cross-regional examination, really, of the ecosystem, and in the end, how it really influenced Israeli policy, Israeli considerations, Israeli foreign policy as a whole. So how does the normalization or the slow process of normalization, let's say, between Turkey and the UAE influence the future possibility to create or to renew the strategic dialogue between Israel and Turkey? How do we see the new interest by the EU regarding the southern neighborhood? How can that influence Israeli policy in Gaza or large-scale cooperation? All of those different dots connects when we examine it from an ecosystemic level. And we examine it first and foremost, focusing on foreign policy and diplomacy. I think that's what really provides us with a unique value here. But the second thing really is the vision that we have to challenge paradigms altogether. And that really takes me into this wonderful product, Mitvim's Foreign Policy Index, which was conducted for the 9th year with the support and the help together actually with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Israel. And the paradigm that we are challenging here is really something of an Israeli basic assumption, especially on decision makers level, that foreign policy is really the property of the higher echelons. It's really about experts, decision makers. It's really about the high levels of officials and so on. What we're trying to do here is to actually try to convey, to access the public and to understand public views about core foreign policy issues on a range of topics, really, from Israel's policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians to Israel's policy of exporting weapons. And, Pegasus and NSO and all have an important role in this one, So we are touching each one of those subjects in order to identify trends. Now, we are all veterans of looking into surveys. And as they say, surveys are like holy verses. You can choose and pick to justify whatever you want to promote. But the interesting thing about this one is really the trends and the way you can challenge some of the basic perceptions about the public perception and the way those new trends influence the possibility for a change of policy. Now, this survey serves as a working tool for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a one of a kind that provides sometimes even political capital for specific policy recommendations. So I would like to deal with, let's say, 3 major surprises, or places where our perception of the Israeli public was refuted. First of all, when we look at the Israeli public, there's this basic assumption that the Israeli public may be reflecting Kissinger's famous quote that Israel doesn't have a foreign policy, only a domestic policy. Israeli public seemingly is focused on his own issues, meaning specific threats, somewhat detached from the global agenda, global topics, and so on, mainly, as we call it, kachol lavan, blue and white. And I think this survey, especially if you compare it with previous years, shows, maybe because of COVID, maybe because of other issues, maybe because of climate change, that the Israeli public is thinking much more, I would define it globally, much more connected to the global issues, and in many ways, come to terms with the fact that the answer to many of Israel's strategic problems goes through or necessitates cooperation with the international system. We see it in 3 major issues. We see it, first of all, when it comes to climate crisis, and we review it in the next couple of slides, but just in general, we are trying to keep or to maintain the real electoral deviation within the Israeli public. So 70% of the respondents of this foreign policy index define themselves as right or center-right. And yet we see across the political field an incredible, really, support for the issue of placing climate change front and center in Israel's priorities and cooperation with the world, and as we are going to examine, with the region in building coalition to deal with it. We basically, Israelis prioritize that first in their, I mean, above Israel-Palestinian, really above Israel-Europe or Israel-Middle East relations. Really a major issue. There's a complete turn, even a drastic turn in Israeli perception of the most effective way for the government of Israel to deal with the COVID crisis. So if last year it was mostly about handling that within Israeli boundaries, this is a splendid isolation approach, Israel is an island. This year, you see that a majority in the Israeli public supports placing foreign aid in equipment and money to programs like COVAX and others as the best solution, as the most likely solution to actually affect the situation altogether. So you see a completely different approach of the Israeli public. And it goes also to a landslide, over 64% of Israelis, something which is, if you know, the Israeli public is quite rare on every question, basically, supporting limitations on the export of weapons and surveillance systems, technological systems to regimes that has a bad reputation when it comes to human rights. So we can already see a different global approach. Now, maybe if we move to the next slide, Victoria. We were discussing the issue of the Israeli public as a force of stagnation, a public which is radicalized, which is, in the last couple of years had a turn towards the right wing generally that prioritized the Palestinian issue on a low plane. All of those things are true. They also come out of our survey. But what we do see, and it is quite fascinating because this survey was actually conducted somewhat 3 or 4 months after the May escalation of last year, the Gaza escalation. And we see a public that while being asked about the right policy towards the Palestinians is very confused. You can see a public that acknowledges that the old paradigm basically has collapsed. I mean, I think Gaza is a major issue here. Less than 10% of the Israeli public supports the Netanyahu government approach, meaning zero political initiative and trying to freeze the situation. You see it in the Palestinian issue. You see it also in other issues, like on the question of Iran, where we find that a majority within the Israeli public, when asked about the most effective way to face the Iranian threat, choose diplomatic solutions and not independent military action, including, by the way, a majority among the very important center-right in Israel. So, those are already surprises. I would say it's an indication that the Israeli public understand the futility of the old paradigm of what you used to call war between the wars, of a planned paralysis when it comes to political initiative, when it comes to diplomatic initiative. They still are not sure about the alternative. They are still not sure about what should be the alternative paradigm. To us as a think tank, to the international community, to the civil society community in Israel, that's a very important lesson because it leaves an open gap to fill with proactive ideas. It calls us and it provides us with the opportunity to present an alternative paradigm. So this is really about the collapse of the old paradigm. And then when we look closer, we are conducting this survey. We can move to the next slide. We are basically conducting the survey a year or a year and a half after the Abraham Accords. And, obviously a major focus here was on investigating the way Israelis see the Accords and all together. And Ksenia and Lior already spoke about the challenges that we currently have in preserving the momentum of the normalization agreements, in expanding the normalization agreements, in connecting, and really shifting the course by reconnecting the regional and the Israeli-Palestinian courses here. But I think that, when you ask the Israeli public, what do you think about those accords, a year and a half after the signing, basically, you get a very interesting picture. First of all, you get the statistical equivalent of the jury is still out. We really don't know. A third of the Israeli public believes that it's a turning point, historical one. A third sees that as a marginal, yet another gimmick, basically, or a marginal event. And a third, a very high percentage, just, they can't really answer at the moment. They haven't formed their vision or their opinion about that. But when you look closer, what you see is that when Israelis are asked about the major strategic problems that Israel is facing, And I'm tempted to repeat Bennett's, Iran, Iran, and Iran. But this time I'm going to be a little bit more diversified. Iran, climate change, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They turn into the regional community. They turn into the normalization agreement. And they turn into the region as the sort of a remedy for the strategic problems, or as an answer in all kinds of issues. So when we ask about the best way to confront Iran's nuclear project, the idea, you can say feasible or not, but at least the idea of forming coalition, diplomatic, not necessarily military, coalition to contain Iran is the leading subject. When we deal with climate change, really is surprising, 57% of Israelis allocate high priority to the topic of building regional cooperation, regional coalitions to confront the climate crisis. And maybe the most important, I would say the most important thing, because it leads us in our own efforts. We spoke a lot about the obstacles of leveraging normalization for the sake of promoting Israeli-Palestinian peace, really against let's say the intentions of the architects of those agreements, to really try to use one for the benefit of the other. And those obstacles are there, UAE relations with PA or lack of relations and so on. But I think that the Israeli public has spoken in a great voice here. 53% of Israelis support utilizing the relations with the normalization countries in order to promote peace with the Palestinians. And mind you, peace, not reduction of tensions, not. So what I'm saying is that for the first time, we see a real token that at least the Israeli public is willing to preserve, is willing to, I wouldn't say compromise, but maybe to abstain from certain things in order to maintain. We see a topic of real value for the Israeli public, and we see something that the Israeli public sees as a certain game changer, or at least a potential game changer, even when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian topic, which they perceived with quite pessimistic views. So when we speak about dynamics of change, and this is something we're really focused on, finding those opportunities, those dynamics of change that we can later on utilize together with the international community, I think that one is one of the most encouraging. And also, a piece of data that requires further examination. We'll do that in the coming year, but we see a lead. We see we see a specific direction that we should definitely follow. So again, this tool, I invite you to take a closer look at this data, because I think that when you combine that, the public view about those topics, with the certain, I would say, somewhat opportunities, limited but existing opportunities with the new government in Israel, I think that the combination can manufacture, and I'm saying it quite cautiously, some pathways for policy initiatives, and some pathways maybe even for change on those topics. I'm just going to finish my part by saying that, we have an incredible group of thinkers here, of diplomats. You are there in the trenches of international diplomacy. And I would like to invite you not just to present questions, but also comments and your own analysis. I know it's a very unlikely. Most of the times in our panels, we're trying to push towards the questions, but I would also love to use this opportunity. And Victoria, please do not assassinate me later on, but I do like to also hear some processed views that you have on the topics that we raise here. So feel free to also present comments and not just questions. I know it's a very counterintuitive request. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward for our discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Gil. Promise that I too love hearing insights. Doesn't only have to be questions. You're forgiven. Great. And just also, Gil wrote an op-ed recently on kind of that issue of multilateralism and the issue of Palestinian peace. So that is in the chat for you, as well as the link to the Foreign Policy Index with all of these very fun infographics, as well as some more detailed commentary, if that is what you're interested in as well.